photojournalist Robert Nicklesberg is revisiting a sordid period of America's history and its dubious role in Latin America, particularly El Salvador, in a new book 4 decades after he first chronicled it in striking pictures. The book, published by Kehrer Verlag, carries previously unpublished images shot by him for Time magazine, which illuminate an important chapter in Latin American history. The images are supplemented by essays by renowned journalists, including one by Nicklesberg. The book's blurb says, and I quote, "In the early 1980s, the Cold War clashes that had bloodied other parts of the world shifted to Central America. Following the overthrow of Nicaragua's Somoza government by the left-wing Sandinista rebels in 1979, the United States sought to prop up El Salvador's right-wing military government as a backdrop against homegrown insurgents and rising Soviet and Cuban influence. Its role helped fuel a lethal 13-year civil war." Unquote. Robert spoke to MCR from his home in Brooklyn, New York. Welcome to Mindshare Reports. Bob, it's an absolute pleasure to have you.
Mike, it's the pleasure is mine. Really, it's been far too long.
It is. And many congratulations on your remarkable book, Legacy of Lies, El Salvador, 1981-84.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
There is a telling passage in your own piece where you say the horror unleashed by the Salvadoran security forces permeated every aspect of daily life. My images documenting the chaos seemed inadequate against the stream of lies coming from San Salvador and Washington. I felt exhausted and ineffective, unquote. That's quite a thing to say for a photojournalist. Tell me a bit about it. The fact that you felt a sense of inadequacy about your photographs.
Well, I don't think it's different for any writer or photographer, really, over a period of time. Remember, I'm looking at this from the perspective of 4 years of work and countless pleasures as well as frustrations. And that goes with most of journalism from what I've seen. A writer will complain about a paragraph that was turned around or removed. And very often I found in a word-driven publication, which Time magazine was in the analog period, you had to compete for space. And you competed for what is called real estate on the page. And I very often found I could celebrate if I had one picture in an article, one. And that was a success of a week's worth of work. And remember, we as journalists worked for the printed page. That was our messenger, that was our vehicle, that was our footprint. It was essential to get into the magazine. That proved your credibility with your peers. And whether it was in color or black and white, obviously you wanted size. But also back at that time, Mike, writers who ran the magazine with editors felt very possessive about their real estate and their columns, and that a picture was inferior to their words. Now, that has come full circle. Of course, we live in a visual world. And I felt, well, fair enough. But I was also competing against the Washington reporting for my story, not New York. The power, center of power for the United States was Washington. And I was in the field. So New York was the go-between between the reporting from Washington, which had Pentagon reporting, State Department reporting, intelligence reporting, even agriculture. For land reform stories, you went to the Department of Agriculture because they had the experts on land reform and irrigation and what was possible given the location of the country near the equator. So there were a lot of competing forces that I was up against. And I feel on a day-to-day basis, I had full license to go and do whatever I wanted related to the story. I never had any restrictions on that. And I made sure that I was in sync with the reporter for 4 years. He was my housemate. We shared on story proposals. We shared on logistics. We shared on goals and aspirations for our pieces. We planned out a week in advance, 3 weeks in advance, 6 months in advance. We planned stories. So the frustrations that I mentioned in the essay are in fact general ones.
Right.
And I've maintained those frustrations, have maintained for a long time, and includes my coverage of South Asia, or my coverage of Southeast Asia, or in particular Latin America. There is an expression that people will do everything for Latin America except read about it. So it was often the first article that got spiked if they needed space for, say, something, if the monsoons hit the Philippines and it was an incredible disaster. So they needed extra pages. They would take it away from Latin America and move. So these are also part of, and you can't go into the detail in an essay like that.
I understand. Yeah.
So the mechanics and the background to my frustrations are also important. And I think other journalists would recognize those.
But doesn't the fact that you were on the ground in action compared to the Washington establishmentarian journalists, that you should have stood out automatically, right?
Well, there's a hierarchy, there's no doubt. And New York and Washington, there's a corridor. It's not only professional, but it's also social.
Right.
So the New York people would come down to Washington and want to be in the presence of the government officials that the reporters there were dealing with. They'd want to meet them, and it improved access for everybody. They had access to the coat and tie, the VIP crowd. We had access to people in military fatigues, carrying weapons. We were automatically the opposition, automatically. So you had to balance that off with your frustrations and your access in the field. And I worked every day of the week, nonstop, on gaining access. That was my biggest challenge, access. And since I represented a reputable publication and I handled it with a level of expertise and sophistication, I maintained that access, and I could move that around depending upon what was needed. And the editors in New York relied on that. Now, here's an issue that I found incredibly pertinent, and I'll take you out of Central America and put you into South Asia. The reporter and I in Afghanistan, the Time magazine reporter, were chasing down some militant group, a Sunni group, Iranian, that had access to Pakistan territory that would go into Iran in southeast corner of Iran, and they were a guerrilla force. They had refuge in Pakistan. They were Sunni, and as you know, Iran is Shia.
Right.
So they were a threat to the Iranian government. We knew that in that southwest corner of Afghanistan and the northeast corner of Pakistan, Iran, and Afghanistan, that triangle, that's where the militant group was hanging out. The reporter and I got over there, and we could see the smuggling routes across the border on motorcycles, trucks, unofficial crossing points of the border. We proposed a story on that, and Time magazine wanted to discuss it with their sources in the Pentagon, which is the way you back stories up. What's going on out there? Because we had heard that special forces were being used out, U.S. special forces were being used out there. This may have been 2006, after the Taliban and Al Qaeda had been kicked out. What they felt in the Pentagon was that we were ahead of the story, that they really didn't want news of that out so soon. Yes, but if you could keep your powder dry, we'll feed you parts of that later. But right now, it's not an opportune time to reveal or report on that. So we did not get the backing or the support, the backup that was needed for the Washington reporter from their source in the Pentagon.
I see.
So the story ran, but it did not include so much of that information. So go back to Central America. The U.S. in the Cold War period, when I was there, I started I actually went down in 1979, but didn't live there until 1981. There were smuggling routes for and arms suppliers were all over the place. Satellite pictures were being used, aircraft were being used, but none of that was really public. And they didn't want that information out there yet. So we would find evidence of it, but could it be proved and backed up by our contacts for the time reporting in Washington? If they didn't want that information confirmed, which then created all kinds of diplomatic issues among capitals, it affected the intelligence department in Mexico. It affected the intelligence department in Honduras, in El Salvador, all the people involved in the maneuverings of this three-dimensional chessboard. Remember, my intent was to illustrate foreign policy. And if I couldn't put a camera to it, maybe the reporter could write about it, but he had to get it confirmed.
Right.
And if the main sources in a battle, in a conflict, in a war, there are many experts. And in that hierarchy, it has to be supported 100% before it goes to print. And this is back in the day when you had fact checkers.
Right.
You had an office full of fact checkers for each article. And you also had lawyers looking at this for slander or liability. You had attorneys going through each column, each paragraph, looking for any possible issues that could come up. So these are parts of the frustration of knowing the region and knowing what you can do with your access and then being asked to slow down or stop.
Right.
So you could come back another week, another month, but it was very difficult to repackage old material into a new mousetrap that would catch, or a new light bulb that would catch an editor's attention. Oh, you tried that before. I don't know if we have space for it this week. But these are some of the frustrations that go along with a conflict that is 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The conflict never stopped.
Right.
And you can see that at any point in the war. You know, I spoke to a journalist last night who had a Zoom call with a woman in Ukraine. And she had gotten up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to the Donbass before she came back to Kyiv to have the Zoom call with my friend here in New York. She had reported on the front line.
Amazing.
So, you know, all of these things continue and get wrapped into the complexities of a story. And if I don't get a picture, well, I lose the space to words, and I have to make up for it at some point in my own mind. How you're motivated is to keep the photography going regardless of the restrictions or what can you say, impediments of full-time journalism.
Right. You know, that brings me to a point that you make, that the Reagan administration kept claiming that situation was improving between 1979 and 1985, even though nearly 40,000 people were murdered by the right-wing death squads. Now, what does that do to a photographer? Because these are very visual things. 40,000 people dying over a period of time. There is a lot to record in terms of photography. How did you navigate that against these official claims of things improving?
I maintained my position as the counter narrative because I came across proof that their argument was specious
Right.
and on thin ice. And they were dissembling all of these reports of how negative things were. Progress was not being made. And in fact, the Salvadoran military and security forces, who were in control of the country, not the political characters, didn't care. They knew that if they could claim some kind of progress, that the money would continue to flow.
I see.
And progress could be measured in millimeters. Millimeters.
Mm.
Oh, only 30 people were killed this week? It's down from 40, so it's measurable?
Yeah. So give
Now,
us more money now.
sure. And we had this incredible investigation by Congress in Washington. Every 6 months, aid had to be was debated and approved to make sure human rights were improving, land reform was going forward before the spigots opened for another 6 month period. We knew when these hearings were going to be held. So 4 weeks out, the reporter and I would start gathering information, images, as well as quotes that the reporter would gather, interviews, working that into the 6 month testing of how are things going, the progress report. Every time I came across something related to the violence, I documented it. Now, it may not be applicable to that week's story, but it would go into the story bank. And they could use that to illustrate a pretty big story, 3 pages, maybe 2 pages in Time magazine was a lot.
Yeah.
Those pictures that I took 3 weeks prior to the hearings were then brought forward. So I continued to build an inventory of documents, of illustrations, of images that proved the government, the United States, wrong.
Yeah. You write about a rather compelling passage about your housekeeper on a long route to work in your apartment would see bodies dumped by the death squads. Now it's cinematic at some level. Tell me a bit about that. I mean, when I read that, I was picturing the big screen of this U.S. photographer in that place. I mean, it was so visual to me. It must have been quite striking for you. You were there.
You know, it's impossible to avoid the Civil War when you're living in it. Impossible.
Right.
And this is a very densely populated country. It's very small, high population centers around the capital. And the housekeeper came 2-3 times a week. It wasn't every day. She cleaned and cooked. We had a flat, a good sized flat in an upper middle class neighborhood, which meant it was safe and secure. And she would come at 9 o'clock. She took 2 buses to get to us. And she had to walk the perimeter of one shanty town, slum, catch another bus. And the way the death squads worked was they would make sure that those bodies that they had were dumped in places where they felt the population was vulnerable to being recruited for the left. It's true. If you went up into the hills to the guerrilla camps, you would find that those were the parts of the city that people came from, where the bodies were dumped. Every time you kill one person, you create more militants. That's the way it worked there. You create more enemies. People have no recourse, no justice. So she was confident enough, thick-skinned enough that it didn't really bother her, but that's what they also talked about amongst themselves. It wasn't just us as an interview.
Right.
What'd you see on the way? How was it? How was the bus trip? And some days she said we saw nothing, some days one or two. We'd try to go there, but by the time she reached our place, the bodies had been picked up, put into the morgue. Sometimes we got to that location, but it was always navigating, getting access to these locations was problematic.
Right.
So you would go to the funeral, which would be the next day or 2 days later. You'd go to the funeral home to see the casket, if you could get a picture of that. If the family members were there at the morgue, you tried to represent whatever she reported to you.
Right.
And again, that was not every day, not every week, but it was often enough that I have a picture of her, and every time it didn't make it into the book, but when I see that picture of her, I'm reminded of what she had to put up with on a daily basis.
Yeah.
Also, going home, she had to take 2 buses.
Right.
And there could be a body on the way home.
Yeah.
Not just in the morning.
When you first went to El Salvador in 1979, what were your impressions about what was unfolding in that part of the world and the U.S. role in it? Of course, the skullduggery started becoming apparent to you over a period of time, but what was your initial impression as you went there?
In 1979, it was Nicaragua where I went. It wasn't El Salvador.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
So remember, I grew up during the period of the Vietnam War and the civil rights movement on a domestic front in the United States. The Vietnam War in 1968, when I was 18, I had to register with the draft board because conscription was an issue. And I had a student deferment. All the friends that I grew up with in our neighborhood, we all went to college. So we had what was called a 2S deferment. As long as you stayed in college, you were not in the conscription pool. In 1968, Mike, there were 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. 500,000.
Yeah.
In 1965, there were only, and I was 15 then, there were only 190,000. So between 65 and 68, when I became an adult, legal, there were 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. And none of us, not one of our parents or families, wanted us to go. Nobody volunteered. You got grabbed not necessarily on the sidewalk, by picked up because they need recruits, but they certainly had a quota. So that mindset of good reports of a bad situation permeated my whole youth. You would divide by 2. If the US government said, well, we killed 100 communists today in the jungles, you divide by 2. You doubted. Did you actually count 100 North Vietnamese Viet Cong? So I went down to Central America, having followed the leadership in Nicaragua. Both the Somozas, who were presidents of that country, went to West Point, the military academy in the United States, a prestigious school. Right. They went back, they continued to control that country in a feudal situation, slavery practically. And I doubted that the United States was happy that the Somoza family was about to be kicked out. So that was the motivation. And you could tell from the reports in 1979, I was living in Washington and following foreign affairs very closely. I knew this was getting close to the time where pictures were coming out, reports in the New York Times, Miami Herald, Chicago Tribune, Boston Globe, Los Angeles Times. Things were not going well for the Somoza family. And I went to the southern border of Costa Rica, northern border of Costa Rica, and the southern border of Nicaragua. The Pan American Highway runs up that. And during the Cold War period, there was always this talk of the Soviets are here, the Cubans have sent in military advisors to the Sandinistas, but we never saw them. So I got to the border, Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and they came out of their training camps. We knew there were training camps in the Costa Rican side for the Sandinistas. And who was leading the charge but 4 or 5 Cuban military officers
I see.
in brown uniforms? So there I had proof. I knew they were there, but you never saw them. So they were in the backyard of the United States. That's considered the backyard territory. Right. And the U.S., through the Monroe Doctrine, you may have heard of something, an antiquated principle, but don't mess around in our backyard. We won't mess around in your backyard. Total hogwash, of course, but this is the way it worked. And I realized that the domino theory that had been applied to Vietnam, if Vietnam collapses, Cambodia will collapse. If Cambodia collapses, Laos will collapse. If Laos collapses, Thailand will collapse. The domino theory was applied to Central America. And we saw that as a specious argument. Yes, they were worried about conflicts that dealt with liberation, but the United States had to be careful. The public was not really believing it anymore. And the amount of violence that was used in El Salvador was minimal compared to Vietnam. But the credibility of the argument that we need to stop them was also on thin ice, in my opinion, as a student of history, of politics, and as someone who wanted to illustrate foreign policy. That's what I wanted to do when I went down there. I wanted to put pictures to policy.
Right.
And I came up realizing I could hold them accountable.
Yeah.
And so could the reporter. So this was my whole basis. And in 1954, the CIA pulled a coup in Guatemala. And the effects of that were awful. To this day, that country still suffers from that 1954 coup. I also worked in Guatemala. Far more sinister and mysterious. Far more.
I see.
Extremely difficult to work and extremely violent, but you couldn't get to it. It was mountainous. One road in, they were blocked. They had artillery, they had helicopters, they had a lot of knowledge on how to fight a civil war in Guatemala. And nobody really wanted to help us in Guatemala. But I knew if I stayed there long enough, I would probably come across interesting material. But at the same time, nobody cared in New York or Washington. So we concentrated on El Salvador vis-a-vis the Vietnam War background. If they fall in Nicaragua, they'll fall in Salvador. If they fall in Salvador, Guatemala will fall, Honduras will fall, and pretty soon, they'll be at the Texas border.
Right.
And that's still the case, the mindset.
It became rather personal for you in a wrenching way, and you write about it. The Newsweek photographer with you, Mr. John Hoagland, being machine gunned down by Salvadoran soldiers firing from across the street within inches of you. What mark did that leave on you as a human being and as a photojournalist?
Well, I had to pull my ankles in. The bullets were that close.
Oh, I see.
And then they tried to take his clothes, his civilian clothes, as they retreated.
Oh.
Take their uniforms off and pull off John Hoagland's clothes. It was literally right here.
Yeah.
Fell down right next to me. So it was clear they were aiming for us. And it still, of course, the memories never leave you. I had to carry him out, put him in my car.
Oh,
And I had worked with him for years, my entire time there. We collaborated. We were competitors, remember? Newsweek and Time
right.
were
Exactly.
competition, but we knew how to cover each other properly. You shoot that way, I'll shoot in that direction. And
Yeah.
we're where we need to be, but it won't be obvious that I'm looking over your shoulder.
Right.
So I realized it was time to perhaps think about leaving.
I see.
And you can't really maintain your full working capacity. It's intimidating.
Yeah.
And it was a big disappointment. And I knew, to get more into the weeds, that the military, the Salvadoran military in that part of the country was not very well thought of. They were laggards, lazy, not well trained in that particular garrison that those troops came from.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't surprised that we were shot at, but I didn't it was clear who we were.
Right.
If they thought we were guerrillas, because they were being surrounded at the time, the noose was getting tighter and tighter and tighter on the military on that road. Mortars were coming closer and closer and closer to that position. They knew we were there.
Right.
And it lets you down. How can I maintain my level of access to a group of fools if I'm going to end up being shot at? So I left 6 months later. It was time to go.
I see. But to just last couple of things to change the gears a bit. You've done equally extensive photojournalism out of Afghanistan. How would you compare the two conflicts in terms of the sheer kinetic visual energy of the photographer? Because Afghanistan has the elements are so vast. It's a very good looking country in many ways because of the mountains. Purely visually, I'm interested to know how you approached Afghanistan as separately from Latin America.
With a deep amount of respect, and I approached it very slowly because the scale alone,
Right.
not only from the Afghan side, but we had access through Peshawar, Pakistan. That was still permissible. And the Khyber Pass, the historic resonance of that geographic area from Rudyard Kipling and from the British Empire days. You were retracing those steps. Churchill was there.
Right.
The chaos in Jalalabad when the Brits were kicked out of Kabul, you could actually see those forts. In El Salvador, it was just in a matter of scale, it didn't have any comparison, but certainly the expertise that I developed in Central America, I applied, but exponentially in greater amounts for South Asia, because the geographic area was so much bigger.
Right.
And you needed logistical coordination well beyond human capacity. And whatever New York or Hong Kong, where the other Time magazine office was, had no idea what we had to do in order to get from A to B.
Yeah, I can imagine that.
None at all. And that doesn't even include India, working on the expense of the size of India alone, and how you navigated the train stations or the flights that were canceled. They didn't have any idea. And remember, I sent all my film out unprocessed.
Yeah.
So I had to think constantly in logistical terms, but the challenges were real, and the success and the pleasure of a successful story, getting it in on time, was equal to El Salvador, even though El Salvador was only a 3-hour flight from the United States to Miami, for instance.
Right.
But the logistics were equally difficult in making sure you got your film all the way up to New York. I needed 24 hours to do it from Delhi. From El Salvador, you just needed a 3-hour flight. And then another 3-hour flight to New York from Miami. But the challenges were minor compared to the challenges of South Asia.
Right. To conclude, 4 decades after what you witnessed, how do you think history has played out in the region from the American standpoint? I mean, El Salvador, etc.
Where I found the film that had sat idle for over 25 years, not looked at, these pictures were not really edited. A few were published, but essentially nothing had been seen since 1984 of the black and white pictures. Nothing. A few headshots, but you can convert color to black and white just as a. So the black and white wasn't needed. It was, I own the film, the copyright. And what I ended up seeing by archiving this material was what we're experiencing today as far as migration, immigration issues on the southern border. This period of time that I was in El Salvador was the foundational period that created that migration traffic and rush north as people tried to flee the violence.
Right.
It's become more now of an economic migration because of climate change and work, and the violence still is there, definitely, with the gangs that the United States has deported back to the countries, the criminal gangs. So I felt there was an importance in reminding people about those early precursor years of where this started and the failure of the United States foreign policy to fix whatever they set out to do. And I saw the similarities of what I had experienced in the 80s come forward in 2021 in Kabul.
Right, exactly.
Which was a 20-year commitment.
Yeah. It's almost as if the US has mastered that kind of failure in many parts of the world. I mean, Afghanistan.
Well, it's not intentional. It's not intentional.
I know, but it seems as if they relish failing like that, be it Iraq, be it Afghanistan, and nobody seems to care beyond the point. Everybody has forgotten Afghanistan. Afghanistan doesn't figure in any conversation these days.
Well, the embassy isn't even open.
Yeah, exactly.
You can't go there. The embassy for Kabul is now in Dubai or in Sharjah, or somewhere. Yes, there are a series of failures, and there's some success, definitely. I won't preclude that, but it certainly reveals how quickly people here, and dealing with accountability. No country really wants to deal with analyzing their mistakes and publishing or publicizing about it. And to have a country, no matter where it is, admit to a mistake is very difficult to ever see, particularly from the seat of power. And the United States has made a number of mistakes. I fully agree with you. And I will continue to monitor that the best I can.
Right. Well, on that note, Bob, it was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it. I hope it was worth your while.
Thank you, Mike.